Hello there, welcome back. My name is Christian. I am a costume maker, a costume designer. I love working with fabrics and other crazy materials to be creative. And this is the second part in my series on demystifying some of the things about working with fabric and sewing. And today we're going to cover one of the things that most people are scared of when they first start out making costumes and fashion for themselves. And that thing is the sewing machine. So this is my sewing machine. This is the Bernina 1008. This is the machine that I get to teach students how to sew on. It's a very robust machine. People have dropped it off the table. We pick it back up and we keep sewing. It's a sewing machine. It's an everyday work sewing machine. Your sewing machine is probably not this one, and it's probably absolutely fine for what you're doing. We can talk more details about sewing machines and getting the right sewing machine for you in a future episode. But for right now, let's talking about sewing machines in broad strokes. When you're at the sewing machine, you want to be relaxed. You know, the more tension you have, the more at unease you are with the task at hand, that's going to reflect in your sewing in a very real way. And so, when we first sit down at the sewing machine, we want to relax. We want to relax. We want to know that we're here to make something pretty, to make some art, to do something creative, and that this sewing machine is going to help us do that. When you operate the sewing machine, I like to think of it the same way as when I operate a car, as I want to be aware of my surroundings, and I want to use great care with what I'm doing with my hands and what I'm doing with my feet, because both those things are going to control what the car does, and that is also true with the sewing machine. The car is a pretty good analogy for working with the sewing machine, because when you are in a car, you are steering with your hands at the steering wheel, and you are controlling the speed of the car with your foot, your right foot. And that is the same with a sewing machine, whether by design or by coincidence. When you are at the sewing machine, you want to be steering the fabric through the sewing machine with your hands, and you want to be controlling the speed of the sewing machine with your foot. It may sound obvious, but I see many novice sewers trying to control the speed of their sewing with their hands, either trying to resist the sewing machine by having a lot of tension and pulling back on the work, pulling back on the fabric, or by wanting to get the task finished as quickly as possible and pulling the fabric through the sewing machine. Again, sort of fighting the idea that you control the speed with your foot and you control the direction with your hands. That's a pretty important lesson. The first thing I tell novice sewers when they first sit down to the sewing machine for the very first time is you're always sewing away from you. That is, the thing that you're working on starts out on your side of the sewing machine and it sews away from you to the place beyond the sewing machine where it is complete. There is never an instance when you have something beyond the sewing machine and then you're sewing it towards you and it's coming into your lap. I've never had to do that. And you shouldn't have to do that either. That's a very strange thing to do. And just stick to the idea that you are sewing away from yourself. Whatever work you have, it's going to go that way. When you step on the pedal, whatever piece of fabric is that you're working on, it wants to go that way, away from you. That's the first thing to think about. The second thing to think about is that if you're working on something large, particularly like a really big skirt or some piece of scenery or whatever it is you're sewing, if it's a large thing, you want to be thinking about the idea that its bulk wants to be off to your left. It wants to be out here somewhere, off to your left. And the reason that is because off to your right is a very limited space when it comes to working with a sewing machine. You don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to cram a large amount of material through the very limited space to the right of where things are being sewed. Sewn. Sewn? Sewn. Instead, you want that bulk to be off to your left. And I think about this, I mean, subconsciously, but I would always think about this when I was learning, when I'd be pinning. When I'm pinning together my pieces that I want to sew together, I'm thinking about how do I want this to be oriented, so going through the sewing machine so that the pins are facing the right way, so I can be taking out the pins as I go, and the thing is off to my left and it's sewing away from me. So there you have it. Lesson 1, you're always sewing away from yourself. Lesson 2, you want the bulk of the thing you're working on to be off to your left. Lesson 3 is the car analogy. It's like driving a car. You want to steer with your hands and you want to control the speed with your feet. Now that those sort of basics are out of the way, let's talk about being in harmony with the sewing machine. So to be in harmony with the sewing machine just basically means to not be in conflict with it. The sewing machine pulls the fabric through the machine at a rate that you get to determine by how hard you press with your foot and by the stitch length that you set. So you should never try to be fighting against those feed dogs, fighting against it pulling the fabric through the sewing machine. That you should be working in harmony with that. Really, you should be able to sew most straight lines with barely touching the fabric at all. That is part of being in harmony. Also, understanding the rhythm of the sewing machine and knowing that it has its sort of its thrust and then it has its release. It punches through what you're working with and then it sort of pulls back on that. If you understand that rhythm, then things that can be very frustrating to sew, very thick materials, you can sew them easily as long as you know the rhythm and when it wants to punch through the material. There's also in that cycle, there's a time to start and end your sewing, start and end your stitches. There's a relaxation that the sewing machine sort of takes when it's ready to start its next stitch. And that's a good time to get into the habit of hearing and understanding that time so that it's not in mid-stitch when you take it out of the sewing machine and you don't know why there's 100 threads attached to your work. So understanding that harmony is going to take time. It's different for different sewing machines. But I'm going to try to show you some of the things so that you can start off to begin with on the right foot. Here we are on the operator's side of the sewing machine. My sewing machine might not look like yours, but it has a lot of the same parts. Sewing machines were invented over 100 years ago, and they kind of all operate very similarly, even if they might look different. So don't be intimidated by the sewing machine. It's an important tool, and we're going to look at each of the parts and what they do so that you don't think that there's a mystery to it, because there isn't a mystery. It's just a tool like any other that's going to help you create amazing creative works once you are comfortable working with it. So here we go. Without any further ado, the parts of the sewing machine. So over here there's lots of knobs and levers and stuff like that, but you don't usually have to worry about most of them. Up here there's some selector switches for different fancy stitches, but most of the time you don't need those either. But there are some very important parts that you do need to know. So we're just going to go over everything. So over here on the side of the sewing machine, you've got the hand wheel. The hand wheel always wants to be turned towards you. It always wants to be turned from the back of the sewing machine counterclockwise towards the front of the sewing machine. It is not happy for this kind of sewing machine anyway for you to turn it clockwise and try to go backwards. You're always wanting to go forwards, and sort of counterintuitively, forwards on the hand wheel is turning it towards you, not away. I always feel like that's sort of backwards, but that's the way all sewing machines are that I've ever used. So keep that in mind. The hand wheel, turn it towards you to go forwards. This sewing machine has a little light that we can turn on and off, and the power. And that's all that's going on the side here. though you can wind a new bobbin thread by part of that operation is loosening this. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're worrying about sewing. All right, up here you have the needle select switch and dial. So the needle select, let's see if I can get them both in frame here. So this outer ring, the dial is going to control how much zigzag there is. Usually when you're sewing, you want 0 zigzag. So this is going to be on 0. But it can do a zigzag stitch, which kind of ends up looking like that. It can do a zigzag stitch, and that's useful for sewing stretchy materials and making repairs and sort of doing like a little overlock over the edge of things so they don't fray. The zigzag stitch, super useful, but most of the time you're just going to sew straight. And then we have the needle position selector, which is this switch. And if you look carefully, you can see that when I click it all the way one way, where's the needle? You can barely see what's going on here. I can make the needle go all the way to the left, all the way to the right, but usually you want it to be right in the middle on 3. And so that's where it's going to stay. This is the buttonholer. This kind of sewing machine makes a buttonhole in 6 easy steps, really 5 easy steps. 6 easy steps. But we're not making buttonholes today, so we don't need to worry about the buttonholer at all. It's not. It's only useful for that one task. Down here, though, you have the stitch length regulator, and this will control how close together your stitches are. If you turn this dial all the way down to 5, then the stitches will be very far apart. Not inches apart from each other, but this creates stitches that are close to like 1/4 of an inch apart. And then the dial goes all the way down to 0, where the stitches aren't any apart and you're just sewing in one spot over and over and over again. And you can see there's an indicator right here of where you want the dial to be when you're doing a buttonhole. We're going to cover that in a different episode, but for right now, most time in the costume shop, we sew around a 4 stitch because we make a lot of mistakes and we do a lot of alterations, and we want to make sure that the mistakes that we make and the alterations that we make are easy to do and quick to do. So a 4 stitch is easy to take out, and it doesn't have as much strength over time, I would say. Whereas if I was sewing a piece of fashion, I think I would have it like at a 2 stitch, which is smaller, stronger, but if I make mistakes, it's going to take longer to take out those mistakes. And it's sort of a more permanent stitch length in a way. Moving on, we've got these specialty stitch selectors. Basically, this big switch here does only one thing. It either has the feed dogs on or the feed dogs off. What are the feed dogs, Christian? The feed dogs are these little teeth. I'm going to remove this for a second. These little teeth here that pull the fabric through under the presser foot as you're sewing. Those are called the feed dogs. And watch, if the feed dogs are on, they're doing their job. But for some stitches, for some sewing work, you want to be controlling the direction of the sewing by hand. And so what you can do is, let's watch this. You can disengage them. And they drop into the sewing machine, and the machine is no longer pulling the fabric through at all. I'm going to turn it back on because almost always you want that on. Back over here at the switch, there are green stitches, specialty stitches, and there are red specialty stitches up here, remember? And then you can select which of these specialty stitches you want. Do you want to do these red stitches? Do you want to do these green stitches? Well, most of the time we want to be sewing straight or at a zigzag, either stitch 1 or stitch 2. So we want this to be on the bottom, 1 and 2, and we want it to be on green down here on this switch. So most of the time, this is on green and this is on this. So you don't have to worry about that switch at all. So we've taken care of all of these. We've taken care of the hand wheel. We've taken care of these specialty stitches up here. This is for winding a new bobbin, which we're going to talk about more in length in just a moment. This up here, this dial, controls the tension on the thread. Many older machines will have a wheel right around here that the thread sort of passes around, and that controls how much tension is on the thread. This tensioner is inside the machine. It's like in here, you can't even see it. So this controls how much tension there is on the thread. Usually, if you have the same kind of thread in the bobbin case as you have up here on the top, then you just want this to be on the red. You want it to be on 5, and that's perfect. These are some thread guides. I'll show you how to thread your sewing machine in just a second. This is a thread guide for when you wind your own bobbin. You don't need to worry about right now. This is part of the thread guide, though I think part of the tensioner mechanism is in here too. It's all inside on these machines. Yeah, I can see some sort of spring. So the tensioner might be in there as opposed to in here. I think it's a combination. Alright, down here you got your needle. Here's a piece of advice. If you have this style of sewing machine that has a bobbin case, if the bobbin case goes in this way, you want the eye of the needle to be facing forward. If the bobbin case goes in this way, then almost certainly you want the eye of the needle to be facing to the left. And usually it only goes in one way, so that mistake is not easy to make. But on older machines using older needles, you can put these needles in any way you want. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. We already talked about the feed dogs. We got this little arm that you can attach into it different presser feet. This is the standard one that we use for most sewing, so you don't have to worry about that most of the time. And then on the back of the machine, there is a handle for raising and lowering the presser foot. Come on, there we go. Raising and lowering the presser foot. I can show you what that is right now. It's gonna come around. This is a long video already. And there's the switch. It raises and lowers the presser foot, as you can see. So again, your sewing machine might not look like this one, but it's going to have similar controls because all home sewing machines these days have the ability to do a zigzag. I'm not sure if all of them can do needle position. I think they should. And all home sewing machines have the stitch length regulator, which will control how close together your stitches are. Oh, I almost forgot that when you do a reverse stitch on this machine, you hold the stitch length regulator up like this, and then it will go in reverse. I really wish, one of the things I wish is there was some way to like lock it in reverse, because sometimes I need both hands when I'm sewing in reverse, but infrequently. So your sewing machine looks like this one in its basics. And now we're going to show you how to thread the sewing machine. No matter what kind of sewing machine you have, the threading is always going to start over here somewhere up in the upper right-hand corner and is going to end in the lower left-hand corner. I've never seen a left-handed sewing machine that goes the other way. I'm left-handed, so I kind of wish they made a left-handed sewing machine, but they don't. So it's always going to be this sort of situation. There's going to be thread in the upper right, and somehow it's got to end up at this needle at the lower left. How it gets there is a little different for every sewing machine, but there's some things that the thread guide is going to help you do to figure that out. Your sewing machine probably came with a manual, and even if it didn't, you can probably find online the instructions for your sewing machine. There's good documentation, especially for Singer sewing machines. Seem to have good documentation for all of the sewing machines they've ever made since the 1800s. So our thread starts out up here, and then it's going to find the first place on the thread guide, which is this hook up here. Then it's going to come down this sort of gully area, and then it's going to go around a hook. And it's going to go back up, and then it's going to go through this this lever up here, which goes up and down. I think it's called the take-up lever. And what it does is, in the cycle of the sewing machine, this will take up the slack during the tension, no tension sequence. So there's going to be a moment of tension, there's going to be a moment of sewing, and then there's going to be a moment of no tension, and then that slack the needs to be taken up before it takes the next stitch. It sounds more complicated than it is. The point is that somewhere on your sewing machine is going to be a lever, an action piece that goes up and down like that. And the thread has to go through that in some way. And so usually on all sewing machines there'll be sort of this Z or N shape created by the thread as it goes down through the tensioner, up through the take-up arm, and then back, take-up lever, I guess, and then back down to right over the needle. This machine has a one hook, and then I'm going to thread the needle from front to back. You always want to thread your needle from front to back or from left to right. I've never seen a sewing machine that threads any other way than that. And you want to make sure the front of your needle is faced to the front or the left, depending on the style of sewing machine you have. You can tell if it's the right side of the needle because there'll be a long groove running the whole, well, most of the length of the needle. That's the front of the needle, whereas the back only has the hole and usually like a little divot, like a little cutout from its otherwise smooth surface that you can feel with your finger, and that indicates the back of the needle. Once I have my needle threaded, the next thing to worry about is the bobbin. The sewing machine works by creating a chain of stitches, a lock stitch, between two separate threads. There has to be a thread up in the top, and there has to be a thread down in the bottom in order to do this lock stitch. The needle pulls the thread down into the machine where it goes around the entirety of the bobbin, around that second thread, and then it's pulled up the other side, and that's what creates that chain stitch. That's how the sewing machine works, is by having the two separate threads, and by the top thread going around the bottom thread. So to accomplish that in this style sewing machine, we have what's called a bobbin case, which looks like this. This is sort of like the Singer standard bobbin case. This one has a long arm to it. I've encountered some Singer machines that have that arm. Some Singers that have the bobbin case, it just doesn't have that arm at all. It's just a piece of metal. No matter what it looks like, there might even be plastic ones. It is where you drop the bobbin into. The bobbin is this separate piece that has the thread wound around it, and you need both, as I've said, for the sewing machine to work. So for this one, let's see if I can center it. You want to put the bobbin case in, and then there's a tensioner on the bobbin case too. You can control the tension of the bobbin by this little tiny screw right there. And so you want your thread to go under that plate in order for the tension to be on it. And on this style of bobbin casing, in order for it to do that, the thread has to pass through this narrow channel under that tension metal and then out this larger hole here, so that when you pull on it you can feel there's a little bit of tension preventing you from just pulling it freely. On this style of bobbin case there is a tiny hole at the end of this arm. I've never encountered a reason to put the thread through that hole, nor does it say anywhere in the instructions for this sewing machine to put the thread through that hole. So that's one of the mysteries of this particular machine. Is this the secret to focus? Yeah. I am not sure what this arm does or does not do, but putting the thread through there just seems to make things worse, so I don't do that. Instead, I'm just going to put it in so that that arm is facing straight up and it clicks in like a puzzle piece. Now that you have the top of the sewing machine threaded and the bottom of the sewing machine threaded, the final step to do is to bring that bobbin thread up to the top side of the stitch plate. To do that, you need to run through the cycle of the sewing machine once by hand to bring that thread up. This sewing machine, its cycle starts where the take-up lever is at a top position, and it's going to go down, and then it's going to come back up, and then that's the end of the cycle. I will show you what I mean. So I'm going to hold the top thread. I'm going to turn this towards me. I'm going to turn the hand wheel towards me. The take-up lever went down. The take-up lever is coming back up. And with it should be, there it is, that bobbin thread. Now I just kind of get them all underneath the presser foot and out of the way. And I'm ready to sew. All right, that's all I have for today about working at the sewing machine. Just sort of the basics of what to keep in mind. I showed you the different parts of the sewing machine. I showed you how to thread the sewing machine. I talked about some things to keep in mind, some philosophy while you're sitting at the sewing machine, and a little bit about how a sewing machine works. And I hope that you found that useful. If so, let me know. If there's something you feel like I left out, let me know. I want to make these really useful, especially to people who are intimidated by working with fabric and who just need a good place to start. I'll see you next time.